There was a woman named Mary in Chicago. She was a journalist. She was very well respected. She was an excellent journalist. As a matter of fact, early on, she was an editor at a publication. When I applied to be the editor of the publication I worked, which was different from the one at which she worked, I quoted in the cover letter a phrase from Dorothy Day that said, "The job of a journalist is to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comforted." I quoted this in the cover letter, and I got the job. Now, this was a secular paper, but it was the spirit of this concept of what's appropriate for affliction versus what's considered appropriate for comfort, and the provocation that is to be expected and I believe appreciated in a good journalist. Anyway, years later, Mary writes a column in the Chicago Defender. This is an old African American newspaper from Chicago. It has quite a reputation of its own. She's talking about the anniversary of Martin Luther King's travels to Cicero and how during the course of a march through Cicero, where, by the way, many different constituents had to gather to support King than we would otherwise try to represent now. King got a rock thrown at him and it hit him in the head. She mentions this in her article, her editorial. I wrote a letter to her directly. I do not believe they published it in the paper, but I put it on what was my blog at the time, challenging her. Challenging this revisionist history of the Chicago movement and King's relationship to the area. See, in the late 90s, I had written an article about the anniversary of Martin Luther King's first attempt to go to Chicago as part of what was known as the Poor People's Campaign. And I introduced this article by discussing how at an ecumenical conference in Alabama, he had quoted a specific verse from the book of Amos. And at that same conference, there was a rabbi from Poland who had fled the Holocaust who quoted the same verse. Somebody understood they both were speaking about similar things and recommended they meet each other. They did, and it began a lifelong friendship and a lifelong struggle with each other. When Martin Luther King first went to Chicago, the majority of the black churches in Chicago were already hooked up with a kickback scheme to the mayor of Chicago and his little apportionment and parcelization of the land as a means of social control program. They didn't want King anywhere near Chicago, and a great deal of the support that King got from Chicago came from the Jewish community in Chicago. Now, one of the major synagogues in Chicago that was a part of the Poor People's Campaign and the building of the Chicago movement is under occupation by the former president of the United States. My understanding is that as soon as he went to Washington, D.C., they put a gated perimeter up within 2 blocks of his house that included that synagogue. I had done an interview with the rabbi at that synagogue on the anniversary of that synagogue. It was the very first article I had published in the local community newspaper before I became editor of Streetwise newspaper, where I wrote my article about the history of the Chicago movement. At the time, there was no racial quota about who was a part of the history of struggle against this injustice. The people I interviewed at the time were people that were a part of the original Chicago movement, including somebody who at the time was an alderman, including somebody who at the time was a member, was in charge of a housing organization. It's changed. I can't get that article. That synagogue's under occupation as part of the personal private compound of the former president. And the whole history of the Chicago movement does not want to account for the contributions of the Jewish community at the time because the black leadership was in some position of fealty to the predominant political leadership, even at the cost of their own constituents. So when I say I have this specific relationship, it's very specific. Right now, on the Church of England Pension Fund page, there's a picture of a cleric in stock getting hit in the forehead. Somebody put together some little circus, one of those games. And they've got the holy man getting hit in the head while he's on the stock block. Did you think that was cute? Did you think that was cute? And then to have your ladies in the Episcopal Church talk about how much they owe the Church of England for their nursing care? I don't think it's cute. I think it's genocidal. It went too far. That's what I mean by cease and desist. Shut it down. You have absolutely no moral authority and no godly backing in what you're doing. It's a complete farce of the rest of us, and it will not abide.